These cows could be the future of agriculture in New Zealand. Their milk formula is blended with kombucha, a special probiotic. It is all part of a trial being carried out by New Zealand dairy giant Fonterra.
The true eureka moment for me was when we got the results of the first cattle trial back, and we were able to show that we got a reduction in methane of up to 20% in those animals. And we've continued to be able to show reduction in those, and obviously we've got other trials underway, but that definitely was the eureka moment.
New Zealand's outsized agricultural industry has made it unusual among industrialized economies. There's around 5 sheep for every person and 2 cows. Half of its greenhouse gas emissions come from farms, and that's something the government wants to change with its plan to make farmers pay for emissions.
Importantly, all money raised from charges on emissions will be recycled back into the system to fund further research, tools and technology, as well as farmer incentives in order to help reduce emissions. All revenue will go back into those goals.
The government plans to reduce methane emissions from farm animals by 10% by 2030 and halve them by 2050. But the plan has come under widespread criticism from farmers who fear for their livelihood. So maybe it is science to the rescue, and New Zealand farmers may very well have to pin their hopes on solutions that could simply reduce emissions.
That's our show. We'll be back in a few hours with more. In the meantime, check us out online, dw.com/business. We're also on YouTube under the DW News channel. I'm Stephen Beardsley. Thanks for watching.
Searching for solutions to the energy crisis. Can Norwegian gas rescue Europe? How much energy can heat pumps actually save in private homes? And can we cut transportation costs? Deutsche Bahn is banking on autonomous trains.
Made in Germany. In 30 minutes on DW.
How about taking a few risks? You could even take a chance on love.
Raring to read.
Don't expect a happy ending.
The DW Literature List. 100 German must-reads. Our interest. The global economy. Our portfolio. DW Business Beyond.
Here's a closer look at the project.
Our mission. To analyze the fight for market dominance. Get a step ahead with DW Business Beyond.
This is DW News coming to you live from Berlin. Ukrainian officials report more attacks on civilian targets. Missiles rain down on towns and cities across the country for a third day. Boosting Ukraine's anti-missile defenses is a top priority at a NATO summit in Brussels. Also coming up, Moscow says it has arrested 8 people over the explosion that damaged the only bridge connecting mainland Russia to occupied Crimea. Plus, the film world adds its voice and some graphic imagery to the protests over the death of a young woman held by Iran's so-called morality police. And the signature tune of one of TV's best-loved characters. Angela Lansbury, star of the long-running series Murder, She Wrote, dies aged 96. Hello, I'm Terry Martin. Good to have you with us. More civilian targets have been destroyed in a third day of Russian drone and missile attacks against Ukraine. A strike on a crowded market has killed at least 7 people in the town of Avdiivka in the eastern Donetsk region. The governor says there's no military logic behind the attack. Earlier, I asked our correspondent in Kiev, Matthias Böllinger, what he knows about that deadly airstrike in the Donetsk region.
Yeah, we don't know exactly how it was carried out, but what we've seen is pictures on social media, horrific pictures of bodies lying next to market stands. This town, Avdiivka, is one of the towns where the line of confrontation, the line of contact came to a halt in 2014, 2015, and it's ever since been one of the frontline towns and has been frequently shelled since the beginning of the full-scale invasion in February this year. The shelling has been stepped up all along this line, and all these places are under constant fire. It's no surprise that a place like a market has been hit, because the shelling is pretty indiscriminate on civilian objects, on military objects, wherever these shells rain down, wherever they fall.
Now, we have seen these missile attacks across the country hitting numerous towns and cities over the past couple of days. Matthias, how are people in Kiev and elsewhere coping with that?
Well, life is more or less back to normal. People are a little bit more aware of possible strikes, more people going to take shelter at night, for example, when there are air raid alarms. But other than that, all the authorities, the organizations that are working on these kinds of things have been very quick to repair the damage, to patch, for example, holes in the roads, and repair some of the damage done to buildings, so that life can go on and traffic can move on. There's still problems with energy supply. We have power cuts now all across the city at different times in different parts of the city, in order to ease a little bit the pressure on the power grid that has been damaged by these strikes.
The Zaporizhia nuclear plant, Matthias, has had its power supply interrupted again. Is the situation there at that nuclear plant under control now?
That's last info that we have. Yes, these power cuts are, of course, dangerous, because although the power plant has been shut down, although these reactors do not produce electricity at the moment, the fuel that's inside needs constant cooling, even when it's not active, when it's not to the point active that it produces electricity. It is still heating, and it needs to be cooled down, and the cooling systems rely on electricity. The power lines now are used to supply the cooling systems with electricity, rather than exporting electricity from the plant or bringing out electricity from the plant. So this is a vital supply. There are generators that run these cooling systems when the power line is cut off, but of course generators rely on diesel supplies, etc., etc. So this is always a dangerous moment, and the fighting puts this plant under constant stress and under constant and puts it in constant danger of accidents.
Matthias, thank you very much. Our correspondent Matthias Böllinger there in the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv. NATO leaders are gathering in Brussels to discuss boosting Ukraine's anti-missile defenses. Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg says the war has reached a pivotal moment. It's the first time NATO defense ministers have gathered since Russia illegally annexed several Ukrainian territories. At the same time, 50 countries are taking part in a forum set up by the United States to coordinate military aid for Kyiv. The U.S. Defense Secretary spoke of challenging months ahead.
Russia's latest barrage against Ukraine's cities has again killed and wounded innocent civilians and put targets with no military purpose in the crosshairs. We will continue to boost Ukraine's defensive capabilities for today's urgent needs and for the long haul.
DW's Terry Schultz is covering the meeting in Brussels. I asked her how much more military aid Ukraine can expect.
Yes, Terry, that's been a constant refrain from Kyiv since the war began. Weapons, weapons, weapons is what it wants from NATO allies. And today around the table, some 50 countries are meeting to discover exactly what they can give Ukraine, talking about who has what equipment. But as you mentioned, the priority today is going to be air defense, because as much progress as Ukrainian forces have made on the ground, without more complex air defense equipment, they can't do anything about these Russian attacks from the air. And everyone's been very struck by the loss of civilian life in these recent attacks that the NATO Secretary General described as horrific, indiscriminate attacks. So that's certainly going to be the priority here today. But in fact, what they're going to be providing Ukraine ranges all the way to winter clothing, how to deal with the months ahead. So certainly these 50-some countries are discussing what gaps they can help Ukraine fill as they look at Russia's re-energized attacks on Ukrainian cities across the country.
And of course, looming over all of this, Terry, is the nuclear question. How concerned is NATO and its partners that President Putin will make good on his nuclear threats?
Well, you always have to be concerned about the nuclear threat, but NATO has reiterated multiple times in recent days that they have not actually seen Moscow change its posture on nuclear weapons. And that means that they haven't seen any signs that they would actually be moving toward the use of nuclear weapons. At the same time, NATO has decided to go ahead with its annual nuclear deterrence exercises called Steadfast Noon. That's just an exercise that takes place every year where they practice dropping U.S.-supplied nuclear weapons just in case. This is used, of course, to remind Moscow that it is not the only one around here with nuclear weapons, while reminding the Kremlin that this is a war that cannot be won and should never be fought.
The Kremlin, Terry, today said that it considers NATO as fighting on Ukraine's side. Do leaders there in Brussels see it that way?
I think absolutely they say they're on Ukraine's side. Obviously, they are supplying the weapons that the Ukrainians are using to push back the Russians from the territory they've been occupying. Where NATO makes the distinction is that it is not fighting on Ukrainian territory. NATO has been very careful to keep its forces off of Ukraine's territory. They do not want to play into the Russian narrative that this is a fight between NATO and Russia, because that's how the Kremlin wants to portray this, to gin up support domestically among its citizens for fighting back against what Russia would call NATO. But I don't think anyone here would take issue with being on Ukraine's side. In fact, that is exactly what they're doing, and they say that they'll be there for as long as it takes.
Terry, thank you so much as always. DW's Terry Schultz there from the NATO Ministers' Defense meeting in Brussels. Moscow says it has detained 8 suspects connected to last week's explosion on the bridge connecting Russia and the occupied Crimean Peninsula. The security service says they include 5 Russians and 3 Ukrainian and Armenian citizens. Russia says they are suspected of carrying out a terrorist attack allegedly organized by Ukraine. Kyiv has not claimed responsibility for the blast and has called Moscow's investigation nonsense. DW's Kilian Baya in Riga has more details on those arrests.
The FSB has come out with very detailed plans of how this bomb allegedly came from Ukraine to Russia, traveling through Bulgaria, Georgia, Armenia, and then back into Russia. They said it was aboard a truck and it had been hidden inside of plastic construction wrapping thick plastic material under which the explosives were hidden. Around 22 tons heavy the whole thing was, they said. They also said they arrested 2 more Ukrainian nationals of suspected terrorism. These 2 Ukrainian nationals, one of them had been carrying anti-aircraft weapons, and the other one explosives taken from an anti-tank bomb. This kind of fits in line of the narrative that the Russian state media is pushing and the Kremlin is pushing, claiming that the Ukrainian state is a terrorist state. And these arrests, these successes now kind of underline this narrative that the Kremlin is pushing. Now, we also need to remember that this bridge, the Crimean bridge, was of significant symbolic importance to President Putin. It was his pet project. President Putin brought Crimea back to the motherland, so to say, when it was illegally annexed in 2014. This bridge was the umbilical cord which was supposed to connect Crimea to Russia forever. And now the Ukrainians have proven that they can strike it, that they can damage it. In light of recent military defeats by the Russian military, pressure is mounting on the Kremlin and on the Russian Ministry of Defense. And this attack, of course, comes as another significant blow and bad timing.
Now, Israel says it has reached an historic agreement with neighboring Lebanon over their shared maritime border. The deal ends a years-long dispute and unlocks rich gas reserves. It's hoped it could improve ties between the two countries, which have technically been at war for more than 70 years.
The Karish gas field has been at the center of Israel and Lebanon's border dispute for years. But soon drilling ships like this one could move from just testing to actually pumping gas back to the Israeli coast. After the two neighbors seem to have finally reached a deal on their shared border. In a breakthrough that Israeli Prime Minister Yair Lapid said was historic and unprecedented. Lebanon's President Aoun has also welcomed the deal, which would pave the way for his cash-strapped country to begin natural gas exploration. Although following Israel into production would likely take years. In one Israeli coastal town close to the border with Lebanon, some people were supportive.
I think the deal between Israel and Lebanon is a good one that will bring peace. Sometimes it hurts to compromise, but compromise brings good for everyone.
But others worried who would benefit from Lebanese gas.
We all know that a lot of it, Hezbollah going to have a lot of chunk of, they're going to take the money, they're going to have the commission, their cut, and they're going to use it to get more rockets.
Former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has voiced similar criticism, calling the deal an historic surrender to Hezbollah. And that could spell disaster for its future. With polls neck and neck in a general election just weeks away, Netanyahu has promised to cancel the deal if he returns to power.
Now to Iran, where the death of a young woman in the custody of so-called morality police last month has been fueling nationwide unrest as well as a wave of protest around the world. Support has also come from the film industry.
Protesters across Iran continue to defy crackdowns that human rights groups say have left dozens of people dead. The demonstrations were ignited by the death of 22-year-old Mahsa Amini, following her arrest for unsuitable attire by the country's notorious morality police. Some support for the women of Iran from the world of cinema, the cast of Holy Spider at its London premiere. Iranian film director Ali Abbasi on the red carpet wearing cleric's robes and bloodied vampire teeth. His film is inspired by true events and tells the story of a journalist played by Zah Amir Ibrahimi on the trail of a serial killer. The movie also acts as a critique of Iranian society, with the killer who murdered 16 sex workers celebrated by some for cleaning up the streets.
I think we made a movie inspired by a true story which happened 20 years ago. But unfortunately, it's happening right now in Iran. And I think what my character represents in this movie is exactly what's, what women in Iran are just doing right now. They come to the street and they risk their own life for themselves and for the others.
Iranian-born Lord of the Rings star Nazanin Bonyadi using her platform to lead a protest in Los Angeles against the Iranian regime.
I think the worry is that we've had uprisings in Iran once a decade, since 1999 and the student uprising in Iran. The security forces have won. And this time, the thing that's unprecedented is that you're seeing people fight back against the security forces.
With head coverings mandatory for women across Iran, the image of someone cutting her hair is a symbol of defiance. A group of high-profile French actors and musicians have joined campaigners by posting a video of themselves cutting their hair, a symbolic sacrifice in support of Iranian women.